My name is Al Filreis, proudly faculty director here at the Writers House. I just wanted to set this up briefly. Anthony DeCurtis, you have to take his classes if you are of the matriculation status where you can take classes. But even if you're not, Bob, a longtime Penn staff member, retired, but one of the things about taking Anthony DeCurtis's class is that he does this full integration that we dreamed the Writers House would make possible almost 25 years ago, which was you have people in a class and they meet distinguished people in the field of writing, popular culture, and so forth. And then they can come to, either before or after, come to an event like this. So it's like a double feature. And what's happening that's so great today, and Anthony will introduce Hillary in a second, is that Hillary, who was in fact one of those students at a certain point in history, has come back and is sort of fitting into this whole scheme, and it's just a great thing. So this is sort of a plug for people who don't know that Anthony DeCurtis teaches the most amazing classes ever. And it's also a plug for the program that's about to start. Anthony is also like the best interviewer ever, and he's going to introduce Hillary. We're so happy that you're doing this and so delighted, Hillary, and proud that you're back. So Anthony and Hillary, it's all yours.
I think you're supposed to sign that. That's your release. Exactly. Well, introducing Hillary, who's been a very faithful guest to my classes, is really a pleasure. She'll be joining us later upstairs. And, one thing about her that I really remember not only was, just kind of her intelligence and talent as a writer and editor and kind of sparkling personality, but somebody who also I was very much in her debt because she always sent like interesting students to me, like after she took the class. And I miss her being around, not only because I like her, but because I miss that. That was anybody who Hillary sent along was always welcome and always great in class. I should say she's the editor-in-chief of the Infatuation. She was, I think, their first hire. Yes, and has stayed the course through its incredible growth, including adding the Zagat, kind of standard to the Infatuation. It's obviously, it's a site that's now spread to many cities, and we'll be talking about all of that. Before that, she was at BuzzFeed, and but someone who has, none of what's happened with her in terms of her success has surprised me because she always, just had a very kind of clear-headed approach to the things that she did. And her focus and, kind of ability to see the possibilities of something and develop them have really held her in good stead. And I'm just going to be happy to have her here today.
Thank you so much.
Well, Hillary, I guess we should just dive right into the Infatuation. Talk about it. You have a very unique perspective, I think, from kind of walking into a startup at its most startup level, and watching it really expand into something. And I know it's a broad question, but you can take it wherever you want. Just can you tell us a bit about what that experience was like? And continues to be like.
Sure. So I started, the company and site had existed in a form as sort of a blog run by two people who were doing it as a sort of side gig. And they said, let's take this full time and sort of see how far we can take it. And I met them and linked up with them. And that's when we had this idea and the idea was always to get as big as possible. Because once we sort of made that decision to dive in and say, we're all putting everything into this, there wasn't really, failing wasn't really an option because this was our actual job at this point. And from there, the big question was, it was these two guys who had been reviewing restaurants in New York for 5 years while working in the music business. And the first big question we had was, how do we teach more people to do this in the same way? And that was kind of the first challenge that I took on, was how do we let people write in their own voice in Chicago and LA, and how do we find those people? How do we find unique people? And then let them, give them the tools that we have to write this entertaining, accurate, honest, fun content, but also sort of let them be themselves. So the first couple of years, and it's actually almost exactly 5 years ago. It is 5 years ago this Sunday that I started doing this. Those first couple of years were really about trying to find people in other cities that we could teach this model. And a lot of it was like writing the rules as we went and figuring out what were these sort of writing rules and styles and approaches that we were using as the original writers of the site, and then how could we basically write them down and help others sort of internalize those, use them, and then also have their own voices. And also finding those people was kind of the biggest challenge, because when you're not a known entity, and we actually don't hire, we tend to hire people who've not been food writers before, but who have a kind of fresh perspective. The challenge of actually going out and finding those people and convincing them that they could be a good fit for this. Those were kind of the two really big early challenges.
Obviously, I think everybody knows where they can encounter food writing for the most part. And certainly back then, I think that there's a general sort of notion about what people think about when they think about food writing that I think the Infatuation really set out to distinguish itself from. And I wonder if you could talk about what you saw out there and what you saw as missing and what you felt you could bring to this, to that field.
Sure. What we saw missing was a resource that was helpful, useful, and relatable and entertaining to us. There were long form restaurant reviews being written in newspapers locally that were often, first of all, there weren't that many of them. You'd get one a week maybe in the New York Times or New York Magazine. And a lot of them also tended to feel like they were very insidery for people who were familiar with chefs' names. And it just didn't feel like something that any of us, that the founders initially and as we grew, that any of us really related to. So the goal was just to create something that was like at its heart really useful, and that actually answered questions. And the thing that we
almost like the kind of thing that you might say to a friend, rather than, come to this place and spend $350
Exactly.
and
So
because some famous chef just opened it.
We always say everything needs to fall somewhere on the spectrum of useful and entertaining, and it has to have elements of both. And I think there's a lot of food writing that is, eye-opening and tells important stories, and it is investigative, and that's never what we were trying to compete with. We wanted to actually create something, and we've been pretty dogmatic in this idea that everything has to be useful. That this has to be something that sort of answers some question that someone might have. And then how do we make that entertaining and engaging along with that, and familiar in the way it's written and colloquial? There's something that's really funny that happens when people apply to be a food writer, is that they actually, and I see this all the time, take on all these words that they think are food writer words. So, I think the most common one is like saying that a restaurant is nestled on a corner. And the thing we always say is, have you ever used the word nestled out loud? And there are things like that or mouthfeel or succulent. They're just not words that we found that we actually used ourselves out loud. And so we made this decision to create a style guide that really like avoided those words. We have a long list of banned words, and that's not to say those words can't be used somewhere usefully, but like we wanted to codify this idea that you would have these words that we felt represented a kind of like old-fashioned food establishment writing that we wanted to avoid, and sort of send the message and relate to people through that. Even if they didn't see it explicitly, I think you could kind of internalize it.
So how did you go about finding writers? I mean, obviously it's something like a lot of people, I mean, everybody thinks they could write about food,
Sure.
And there's a sense in which, obviously, to a degree, you're almost working on that assumption that, a person who's not a food expert could have something to say about it just on the basis of, having eaten a lot of meals and being able to express themselves. But obviously, there's a difference between that and having something that you describe as informative and entertaining and valuable and useful. Is it kind of hit and miss, or do you when you try people out, what exactly is it that you're looking for?
We definitely don't mandate that they have written about food before, but we do. The thing that I think always sort of sends is, does this person have strong opinions? Can they, that's, as I think any critic should, you can't really be wishy-washy. You have to say, yes, I think this is the best of this thing. I'm obsessed and passionate. And so it's just showing, understanding that they do have enough context to know what they're talking about and to have an opinion and do the research to figure that out. That we find is more important than having studied cooking or having worked in the industry before. So that's kind of the number one thing. And then the writing, I think lack of cliches, just a strong writing style, but finding the people has been the biggest challenge. And I don't have a great answer even for if we had figured it out. The company would probably be even bigger. People have come from everywhere. So we've hired people who were bartenders, comedians, hairstylists. I mean, a few people who were working at magazines before, but a lot of people who we just somehow convinced to apply, and lawyers. I think there are great writers all over the place, and there were people who were passionate about restaurants and knew what they were talking about. They had to have that element of of being able to take a stance and feel confident in what you're saying, which I think any critic needs as a sort of starting point.
Sure. And you talk about having a local voice. I mean, obviously you've launched in Philadelphia. You're in Chicago, as you mentioned, Los Angeles, New York, of course. How do you determine that? What distinguishes an LA voice from a Chicago voice or a Philadelphia voice, for that matter?
I mean, I think the reality is there's no one singular thing. So as long as there's a person who knows that city and sort of has some credibility to talk about it, of course there could never be one singular New York voice. And as we've grown, we've tried to make sure that that's more inclusive and all encompassing as well. I think it's just people who've lived in the city for a while, people who have sort of, again, confidence about that city. The biggest challenge was definitely bringing it to London, where I actually personally found at a certain point that I couldn't edit anymore because there was genuinely enough of a language barrier. Of course, I understood the language, but if you've ever edited for publication, I mean, I think for academics it might be a bit different, but for publication, talking to a captive audience that you're trying to reach through, Facebook and newsletters and things and Google search, there is a lot of nuance that I found talking over a big idea, does this piece make sense, was doable. But on a line editing perspective, I actually said, I think I'm ruining this if I keep being the one kind of doing the line edits. And so we hired a UK editor, and the site got a lot better because it does require, there is a certain and we make sure all our editors spend a lot of time in their cities. So our editor who handles Philadelphia lives in New York but spends a ton of time here because there's nothing that can really replace that face-to-face, boots on the ground interaction and understanding the city itself. You can't fake that. So
how do you determine that a city is a place you want to cover?
Sure. It's been an interesting challenge, but mostly from a launching business perspective, it has been the size of cities. So cities sort of with the biggest populations and economies are the ones that we've gone into first because the opportunity to grow, and it is of course a business, has been biggest in those cities. And initially we had this philosophy that maybe we would try to target cities that we felt were underserved. So like we were like, let's go to these cities where there isn't that much of a media culture, like Denver or Nashville, where we felt like there's a really exciting food scene. And we actually kind of changed course though and decided that we should just try to make a big splash in the biggest cities in the U.S. So the fastest growing, biggest cities we have are pretty parallel to the size of cities. So, it's New York, LA, Chicago, San Francisco, Philly, Boston. And so yeah, that's been kind of and London. So biggest U.S. cities, and London was kind of an experiment, but mostly just from a kind of business and growth perspective, that's what made the most sense. And all those cities have great restaurant scenes that are incredibly diverse and broad, and it's actually been a question of how many people do you need to cover each city. And in LA, it's probably more than Philadelphia, just based on the sheer number of miles it is from one side to the other. But it's been a adjustment and a question as we've gone, and I don't know that there's a perfect answer for any of it.
Sure. Could you talk a bit about some of the challenges that have come up? I mean, obviously you described the one in London, but can you talk about some of the challenges that have come up in different cities, and the way that you address those?
Sure. I think that by nature, having a few critics in each city it's a sort of, I think, an issue that exists in all kinds of criticism. Is that you are relying on one perspective or two perspectives, and so you might not always have the strongest familiarity with a type of cuisine, or the challenges of covering the geography of a city that's large. I think there's still a lot of value, in acquiring Zagat, which was a user-generated, really the first user-generated platform, which I can talk more about as well. I think there's a lot of power in that as well, in the voice of the masses and of people contributing. But I still think there is a place for first-person criticism as well. But it does present challenges. I think it does when you have these characters. I mean, there's a lot of criticism of, I think, any major critic where you're this is the person and this is Roger Ebert's opinion, and not everyone agrees, and it's not inclusive of everything. So I think it's really just that challenge that you probably have with any form of first-person criticism.
Well, let's talk about the Zagat thing, because that's obviously a big deal. I mean, Zagat is, some of you may be too young to have experienced this, but it used to be a thing that everybody would just kind of run out every year and get the book and look, and and it was always, let me look at Zagat and find out, we're going to meet over on the east side. Let me see what's over there. And
which is really the same thing that we offer in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's kind of, but there is this kind of iconic status that it had. And, so taking it on and trying to, bring it into your world, and, I would think, try to retain some of what it did, and, also spin it your way. And, talk about, what all that involved. And was there much discussion about it, about the decision to do it? And, just spill the tea.
Sure. I can tell a bit of the story of how it happened. We actually so Zagat was, I think, in a lot of, really was the first user-generated platform. So before Yelp, before TripAdvisor, it relied on a survey distributed to people, and eventually in cities all over the world, and they rated the restaurants. And then what was interesting about it was that rather than just saying okay, here's all the reviews, do with them what, we're not touching them, which is what a lot of the platforms do now. What Zagat did was they had editors who took all of it and made sense of it into these short 50 to 75 word blurbs, and said here is the opinion of all the people, we're going to give it back to you, which actually I don't really think anyone else has done since that effectively. So kind of was a Rotten Tomatoes concept more, but really with a strong editing perspective. It was sold to Google in 2011, and Google Google worked on it for a couple of years, and eventually decided to sell it. And we saw the opportunity as just a really exciting chance to take on a brand that had really been kind of an inspiration to us. So it was something that was, even though we did the first person critic, it was still this idea of like creating this useful and entertaining publication. And so it was an inspiration to us in a lot of ways. And I think as we took it on, we came to realize that more and more as we met Tim and Nina Zagat, who are the two founders of Zagat, and bear its name. We really saw a lot of parallels in how they kind of ran the business early on. So we're in the midst of reinventing the brand. Editorially, the two will kind of stay separate for the most part. But we're working on a lot of stuff right now. So we actually published a 40th anniversary edition of the book that's coming out in it hasn't been published yet, but it's coming out in November. We're working on a sort of some other editorial ideas and spin-offs of the Zagat brand, but ultimately we will reinvent it as a platform that people can contribute to. So I think we see the value in both, that there should be a voice and a place for people to share their opinions, and hopefully present them to people in a way that they can make sense of, but also have the first-person criticism. I think there's an inherent value to both, and I think most people don't. Like, I don't think choosing a restaurant or learning about restaurants or travel is a zero-sum game. Like, I don't think it's like, oh, I only have my one source. I think people sort of do look at different sources. They look at Instagram and so we thought if we can help shape a larger portion of those, it would be really beneficial.
How has your job changed?
It's changed in a lot of ways. I mean, it's definitely moved into working on more strategy around some of those things that I was just talking about how you position these two brands, working on more multimedia, learning how to be in management. Our editorial team for the Infatuation has grown to more than 30 people across the world now, across 8 time zones. So learning how to sort of manage that and work with different people. And so I had experience editing people before and working on that, but certainly managing a group of people who need to be organized in a more complex way has been one of the bigger changes for sure. But the nice thing is we have a nice group of people who've all been kind of figuring it out together, and so it's been it's nice to have a job where things are constantly changing.
And since we're here in Philadelphia, why don't you talk a bit about, very specifically about the the Philadelphia aspect of the Infatuation?
Sure. I was very excited. I was like, it took a while because there's always a list of things you have to do, and it took us a little longer to get to Philly than I would have liked, because it's a place that's very dear to me, having gone to Penn, but also having come back a lot. And I always loved the restaurant scene and the neighborhoods here. And it was like, it's the thing about every city is more different than you expect. I think you sort of think like the same strategy will be something here. It's like there are all these unique elements of a city, the way people get around, like how do people get around Philadelphia? It's actually pretty varied. More like everyone in New York takes the subway. You can basically assume that. Philadelphia is a little different. Like some people do take SEPTA, some people drive, some people walk, some people bike. And so what neighborhoods are people spending time in? Those are all the questions that we had to ask ourselves. What neighborhoods? And you've seen, I think in Philadelphia, the way that neighborhoods have become restaurant destinations in the past 5 years maybe is pretty staggering. I was in Fishtown last night, and it's like, whoa. When I graduated from Penn in 2011, that wasn't a place that people were going for restaurants, certainly. I really hadn't spent much time around there at all, and you're seeing that all over the city. So Philly is more than almost any city in the U.S. that I've seen has that like number of restaurant heavy neighborhoods where interesting things are happening. Philly's got to be very, very top of the list, I think, of like total huge change over the last 5 to 10 years.
As somebody who lives in New York and teaches here, I can't really, I have my own perspective on this as well, but, why does the editor of the Philadelphia site live in New York? Oh, not
Oh,
the person who oversees the.
We have a local team here.
Okay.
To be clear, it's more of a matter of just kind of organization. So it's someone who's looking at pieces, because we don't have a full time. We only, based on just sort of the number of people and the way it's organized. We don't have a full time editor who sort of copy edits and oversees the editing side in each city. In some cities we do, and we certainly may in Philly as we grow at some point. But we do have a couple people who are in New York but go back and forth to different cities, not writing, but sort of just editing pieces and being it works well where we actually have a liaison to the folks who are in other cities in the New York office. So that's really what their job is kind of just managing groups of cities and working closely with the local writers. But the local writers drive the show in terms of being aware of what neighborhoods should be covered and what restaurants are interesting, what cuisines we should be focusing on, things like that. So that's all very, very driven by the local team, but with a connection to a larger group and community and company. So keeping people across 8 time zones sort of all a part of one group and collective unit is definitely a challenge, but something we've gotten better at over time.
What, how are the determinations made? I mean, obviously you talked about how you determine, what cities you're going into, but just in terms of, like the number of cities, I mean, are you always thinking about adding more cities, or is there a sense of like, we're cool for now and, let's just see how this plays out? Or, what is the energy and maybe the philosophy of the place as far as, that degree of expansion? Is there concern about expanding too fast, or is there, no, this is just go, let's just do it?
We have plans to launch in several more major U.S. cities. We're not particularly strong in Texas. We have like a small Austin site. So we're launching in Houston and Dallas and reviving in D.C., which was something we had a sort of also smaller site without as much coverage on. So focusing there. Atlanta's another interesting one. And then what we want to do is just make sure that we also have coverage in a lot of cities. So are we going to launch full-time staffs in the next 20 cities? I'm not sure yet. That may be, as you said, that may be really a really big spread. So I think when we get through this next wave, we'll decide and make the decision. And as I said, it is a business, so you need to make decisions around that. And I want to make sure, one of the things that I always consider is just I want to make sure that we're growing responsibly and making sure that these cities are going to be able to grow and build to the extent that we can support, employing people in these cities. So there's always that balance, and that's why we've gone towards the biggest cities. But we also have guides in different cities, so we're covering. We have, 1 or 2 at least list guides of restaurants where we hire local freelancers in Minneapolis and San Diego and Baltimore, and we just published one in North for Raleigh, Durham. So we're covering all of those cities in that way before necessarily going full time deep into all of them at once. I've definitely seen a lot of media companies just say, like, we have to be everywhere all at once, and I think that can be oftentimes irresponsible to go so many places at once. We want to make sure that we get it right, have time to focus on the local cities and say, like, how does Philly feel about this? Like, what's the feedback? And pay attention to each one of those cities before we're just like, we're everywhere. Because that, be hard to sort of keep track of where things are going and growing. So it's a balance.
Can you talk about the kind of range of feedback you get? Not necessarily like I love it or I hate it, but just where does it come from? What kinds of things are consistent? What kinds of things do you pay the most attention to? How much of it is there? What about that aspect of this business?
One of the interesting things is in the early days when you launch a city, you turn the lights on, and sometimes it's like, where's the feedback? That's the reality of launch. I've launched a couple of media properties even at Penn. I helped launch Under the Button, which was the has changed a bit, but was sort of like a news site. And it's like, so we learned a lot about when you turn the lights on a website, it's not always like fireworks on day one. There are a couple of things that we've learned to kind of listen for as feedback, as like, this is working. One of the things, and we don't really work directly with restaurants at all. We don't take any money from restaurants and really have quite high journalistic standards on that front. But we sometimes get emails from restaurants and say like, all these people are coming into my restaurant because they said that they read your website. And that's one of those really anecdotal things. Replies to emails, which I actually think are quite, to actually bother to reply to a newsletter is actually quite thoughtful. So we pay attention to that. Facebook and Twitter aren't like the biggest area. I think those are dominated by a much more like political, like daily, argumentative conversation. So those aren't the places that we have like the strongest conversation. In person newsletters, we have a quite active community on Instagram, so we hear from people there, and that's obviously a platform that makes a lot of sense for food because it's so visual. And we actually do a lot of storytelling on Instagram, so we started actually kind of bringing people behind the scenes of the review process on Instagram stories. Sort of did it as just an experiment and grew into a really big piece of content that we do. So we try to be multimedia in that way, and we certainly hear people reply in a really casual way on those platforms. But in terms of the feedback, it's everything. People say, you missed my favorite spot. They say, it can be anything.
Do you have a media strategy? I mean, do you have, like a publicity or promotion kind of strategy that, that you've kind of come up with over the years?
Yeah, it's certainly evolved. We have a marketing team and a communications team, so it is growth in all types of. So a marketing team that does traditional marketing and paid marketing through social media. It's a whole industry, and it's actually quite creative. I think the way that you sort of get around it and how to hack it, not hack in a bad way, but just how to figure that all out is really interesting. And we also do a lot of grassroots marketing events, I think meeting people face to face and building a real community and audience rather than just like followers or just page views has been our goal. Like, let's actually get people that are going to care. We just launched a membership program in New York and hoped that would be an indication that people are actually willing to pay something to get more, which has been successful so far, but still in its early phases. So yeah, it's evolved over time and is constantly growing and definitely will continue to. And we do a lot of local events and talking to local media and go in the local news sometimes to help spread the word. So it's a multifaceted kind of approach there, using all the possible tools, the old-fashioned ones and new.
Where do you see things going? I mean, what would you like to see happen? I mean, obviously, the expansion is great, but is there a particular overarching kind of vision maybe that you have or share about what the site can become?
Sure. I think is to become the go-to resource when you're trying to find a restaurant in as many cities as possible. And by having Zagat and expanding that platform, that will be a way of doing it. By hopefully doing more multimedia, videos, becoming the sort of known go-to brand is the goal there for restaurant discovery, and maintaining the sort of brand value that we have now. If people come to expect something, they hope, or I hope that they come to the site and think it's going to be entertaining, it's going to be accurate, it's going to be funny and irreverent and a good time to read. So sticking to that while growing and becoming, more globally known name is the goal, which I think we certainly have our work cut out for us in that. So the plan is really to focus on that. It's not to say like we're going to do. People have often asked like, are you going to go into music and are you going to go into? And I think are you going to start recommending other things? Never say never. I don't know yet, but right now we're definitely focused on this kind of core competency of restaurants, and there's really so many cities around the world that have exciting restaurant scenes, and the more we can become the go-to for that is the big goal.
Who do you regard as your competition?
I think it's really different in each city and on each. There's a lot of people. So there are a lot of people who cover news, restaurant news in various cities. There are a lot of sites that do that. We don't do that, but they sometimes write reviews as well, and they are that, those are, if you're interested in restaurants, those might be websites that you go to on a daily basis. Local newspapers still, they have really varying, super interesting, but local newspapers have really varying setups in each city, like how they kind of exist right now. So the situation in Philadelphia is obviously, I'm sure many of you have heard about changes at the Inquirer and other sites. In LA, there weren't a ton of restaurant critics for a while. Now there are quite a few. In London, there's like 10 full-time restaurant critics at the newspapers because they still have that culture. So a little different from city to city about who people are going to and relying on for opinions. And the user platforms, they're all, I don't think anyone's doing exactly the same thing. So that's kind of nice. So we're not overly focused on competitors and much more focused on, I don't know what this sound. It could sound trite, but we really are much more focused on the audience. And so what does the audience want that they're not getting, rather than like we have to crush our competitors. Like the focus is like, what are we not serving? What does the audience not have from anyone, and how do we deliver that to them? Because I think there is still a lot where that's the case.
Well, I think this might be a good time to open up the conversation for any of you who might have questions or ideas. Yes?
We have a mic.
You mentioned this experiment with memberships in New York. Can you talk a little bit more about the sort of business plan of the company? Because do I have it right that a major source of your revenue is actually consulting to other companies to do social media and so forth? Or how is it sort of financed currently?
Yeah. It's not, we do, primarily it's brand partnerships, which is basically advertising across multiple platforms. So we're not...
But not restaurant advertising.
Not
right?
restaurant advertising.
How does that work?
So we work with major companies like American Express and a lot of the major spirits and beers who are trying to reach a similar audience that we reach, which is people who are interested in dining. So that's why airlines have been a big partner. We've worked with a lot of people like that. And so what we do with them is they really come on as advertisers because they want to reach our audience. So what they do is they might have an ad on the site. They might be a sponsor of a larger package that we do. So we do a guide to outdoor dining every year. And we've had several, spirits, for example, be the sponsor of that. They want to align with summer activities. So that's a great partnership. But we do a lot of events as well. We do events in restaurants where the partner that we're working with, the advertiser we're working with, is one of those brands rather than the restaurant itself. Of course, the restaurant we pay for the food and room. So we're not necessarily consulting explicitly on like telling another brand how to do social media, but we do make use of social media to advertise in a lot of ways. So you'll see if you go on our Instagram accounts that we work with partners, and we're very careful to choose partners that are brands that we like, that we believe in, that we're actually excited to work with. We just, for example, I think a great example is we did a whole guide around places to eat after you go for a run in New York in partnership with Nike. So those are the types of things that we do. We throw a lot of events where there are also sponsors who come in. So I sometimes describe it as the way you'd see, a big sporting event might be sponsored. That's the type of, when we say brand partnerships, that's typically what we mean. And the membership where people are paying for access to some of our events, they're getting access to special guides, travel guides that the free audience isn't getting. That's a new experiment and a new revenue stream that we're opening up. But historically, it's been by this sort of 360 advertising brand partnerships strategy.
Hillary, when you talk about advertisers wanting to reach your audience, could you describe your audience? Is it possible, what sort of general or specific, information do you have about them that you can share?
I think the people that I always think about reaching is just people that are excited and interested in dining in restaurants, and there are certain demographics that I think go along with that. So I don't work in sales, so I don't know. I don't have like every single detail, but certainly it's a millennial audience, but not exclusively, but really an audience that is excited about travel, dining, experiences. And that's a lot of what, I think most brands are smart enough to know that it's not just about a specific age group. It's not just about, I think there's a lot of shared, you go to restaurants and there are usually a broad group of people who are there. And a lot of brands want to align with dining, whether they're a Spirit or a credit card or a travel, an airline or something. It makes tons of sense for them. So it's been cool. It's opened us up, but we are careful to make sure that it's not, that it's with things that we would support, and none of them are restaurants. So there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's also just such a local business to work with restaurants. It's pretty small, so in order to stay in business, you want to be working kind of with bigger brands, and it's been, so we don't take any free meals. We don't take any money from restaurants. We book under fake names. So that model has allowed us to actually adhere to really strong journalistic ethics of, keeping those two separate, and staying out of the restaurant business has been really, it's been good in a lot of ways in that sense.
How many times a week do you eat out?
It's a hard question because I don't spend most of my time reviewing restaurants anymore. I do pop in to do one or two a month to exercise the muscle. I mean, to be perfect, like I'm sure you have this experience. If there's a time when you're not writing, it's really hard when you go back to it.
Well, for sure. It's hard when you go back to it, even if you are writing.
Exactly. Yeah. So I like to keep the muscle active, but I don't spend most of my time reviewing restaurants anymore. So I'm still out and about. It's important for me to stay up on like what's happening. So when I come to a city, I want to check out what's new, and so that I can have an understanding of trends and what's happening. But I'm not the go-to person on all of that. So we have a great group of critics in New York, who full-time, that is their job and focus. So they're out like 4 to 5 nights a week for sure, and sometimes during lunch as well. And not everything is to write like a long review. It might be research of a neighborhood that we haven't covered. So we realized we hadn't covered a couple of neighborhoods in Queens that well. So we went and spent time, and not every single place that was visited turned into a 500-word review, but it creates like, first of all, for the places that do, it allows you to say like, this is actually the best Thai restaurant in this neighborhood that has a lot of Thai restaurants, because you need that context. You need to have tried a lot of them. You can't just go to one and say it's great. You need to have that context. So there's like a lot of visiting that's research. There's a lot of visiting restaurants that's just research of like, how do I compare this, and how do I rate this, and how do I talk about this? It's like, can't like comment on the latest movie by a certain director if you haven't seen the other ones. So and sometimes those things like don't actually end up in the piece. It's not, you don't have to say like, I've been to this place and I've been to those 3 places, but it shows if you haven't, and it's irresponsible if you haven't.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of work behind the scenes of visiting restaurants that isn't always like, I will now go home and review this.
Yes. You.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. In front of you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
We'll get to you too.
Then just, when you're done, just pass the mic
of
back.
course. So in line with thinking about being responsible about, like, there's so much content, but also, like, when you go to a restaurant and you're with one other person and you order, like, 6 dishes, obviously that's only a third or a fourth of the menu. Mm-hmm. How do you kind of deal with that? And on your site, when you have the 6 dishes reviewed, are those the only 6 that this person has eaten, or are those, just a few of the ones they've gone back several times? Like, what's the workflow in terms of how many dishes a reviewer has eaten at that given restaurant? And like, how are they deciding those dishes over other dishes to present on the site?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't have a like extremely strict rubric of you must visit this restaurant X times, because restaurants are really different. some restaurants might be appropriate to visit 1 or 2 times. Some you might need to visit 3 or 4 times at different times of day because maybe they're open at lunch and dinner. So it's hard to give an exact. People often say, like, how many times do you have to visit a restaurant? And we leave that to the editors and critics to have that conversation, like what is right here and what is responsible, and have you been in the past? So it's always a conversation. And same with the menu. You know, some restaurants only have 8 items on the menu. So in that case, you're going to try everything. In some cases, they have 50, and, you know, we can't spend all of our time and money. We do give the writers resources to try restaurants, of course, but they can't spend all of it in one place. So it's always a question and conversation. And sometimes when you see, on the site we have, for those who don't know, again, this is all about being useful. We have what's called a food rundown, and we have pictures of the dishes that we want to talk about. So sometimes it might be like the majority of ones that we tried or the ones that we think are the standout. But having a list of 20 food items feels like that's not going to be a good reading experience for someone. And a lot of times people are referencing that in the restaurant we found. So we wanted to just make it as useful as possible. And so it just depends on the place and if it's a positive review or negative. It's all about what in this context is going to direct people the best. And that's just a conversation. Like, we spend a lot of time talking about stuff. So like if you're in the reason that we actually have offices and people aren't just running off on their own is we want people to come together and say, like, what do we think? What's the right call here? And then every single review that goes up is like the product of some conversation that's happened. And when you do it enough, you kind of start to figure out, like, this is right, this is not. And you don't always get it totally right. Some people say, you were wrong about this. And you kind of just learn from each one as you go. So it varies.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm a senior at Penn studying English and journalism. I was wondering, like, way back in the day when you were writing the reviews yourself, I don't know if you had experience, like, reviewing restaurants before, but did you come in sort of with that, like, strong opinion stance that you were saying before that you look for in writers, or what was your style? Like, how did you dive into it when it was such a new phase?
It's a great question. I had grown up in New York and had been living there for several years after college by the time I started this. So I think I had a pretty strong sense, but I definitely developed it and learned how to be more critical and how to approach and what areas, like, you also figure out, like, what areas if you're not the only person in the city, which I wasn't. In some cities we only have one person. Figuring out kind of what you know about that the other people don't, maybe whether it's a neighborhood or a type of cuisine that you feel like you have a lot of expertise on. So I sort of started to develop that, whether it was like near where I lived or going to a neighborhood or type of place that we hadn't covered as well. And then through that, I think we often find that people gain that confidence and perspective by, like, writing about stuff that they know well, and then over time take time to learn and become kind of an expert in the whole city. So it builds over time for sure. I felt confident in, I started my career in the world of blogs, of the really, really fast paced, like, publish way too much a day, kind of happy it can't all be found anymore, just because some of it, the quality of the stuff that I wrote when I just graduated college is probably not great. But I did come from that experience of, like, the really fast pace, and I think it was really beneficial to be able to, like, write fast and just be like, okay, this is done. Done is better than perfect. I think I agree with that. So I had confidence in like being like, I wrote something, here it is. I think that's one of the challenges, like, when people are getting started writing, having their writing published in the first place, is like wanting it to be perfect. And that is why, like, that's why we have a lot of editors, is to say, like, let's talk about this. Doesn't seem like your opinion is strong enough. Let's push it. Let's talk about it. So, yeah, I think I got more to say on that.
Okay.
Thank you. So, I know you mentioned that you don't pay too much attention to your competitors, but I was wondering, like, as someone who, like, if I'm looking to make a dinner reservation with my parents, I often try to cross-reference, like, multiple different sites. Like, how much attention does the Infatuation pay attention to what its competitors are saying? Because it's, like, sometimes it's, like, if you have a differing opinion, like, than them, like, how do you consider that? Or, like, even for, like, food guides or, like, I don't know if the Infatuation has like a New York City guide, but like how much attention are you paying that, like if the guide sort of like is different or the same as like what your competitors are saying about these restaurants?
I think we do feel like we have enough expertise at this point to feel strong in our convictions, and in our opinions. So we try not to worry too much about what else is out there. Of course, like, you do reference other sites when you're doing research and trying to figure out what's been written about, and even just for, fact checking things, it can be useful. So I think it's important to read, to pay attention to what's being written out there, but also to make sure that it's not impacting everything you say. I think everyone also has it's also different for different writers. Some people, I think, find like it's helpful for them to know what else has been said, and some people find that they want to go in without knowing anything. I'm sure that's true in other types of criticism, I think, as well. As like, do you want to know that? Do you want to talk through it? I mean, one of the biggest things I've learned is that every writer is really different in their process, and that's good and okay. So part of it is also just learning what's good for you, what's good for the writers that you're working with. So, and it also varies from city to city. There's so many more sites in some cities than others. So, but we definitely try to make sure that we are strong enough in our own opinions to stand behind them 100%. And we definitely disagree on things with other people sometimes, but that's why we really take the time and resources to go back to places and make sure we know what we're talking about. So for the most part, I think we can we can definitely really stand behind those opinions without worrying too much about how it was covered elsewhere.
Anyone? Over here?
Sort of building on previous questions, I don't know if you've mentioned this already, but can you sort of talk about how you got started? I know you said like it came from a background of like blogging, but how did the actual like process of starting Infatuation begin?
Sure. I worked at just a quick history. I worked at a small at a news startup right out of college called Abrams Media. That's where we wrote a ton, wrote a lot every day. Then I went to BuzzFeed in its transition into basically being more of a news organization. When they sort of started in the first phase, 2012, they started hiring more journalists, and I joined and covered a bunch of different things. Moved from like tech to, there was culture, and I wrote sort of about women in business and politics around the 2012 election. Like, it was a whole bunch of things. I covered a little politics during the 2012 election. It was a great place to jump from one thing to another. I ended up writing a lot about YouTube, like really just my interests. And I was mostly an editor, so that's where I kind of but I would also like to be like, I wrote this tech piece and find a place for it while also sort of doing this editing job. So I had written one piece about food, about restaurants in New York City. And this is, I think, a useful thing is like I had, from having started sites before, had learned this thing of like, you send people your stuff if you're proud of it, who might be interested. So I had been following the Infatuation when it was a blog, essentially, and I sent it to the founders and said like, thought you guys might find this interesting, like maybe you'll tweet it out. That was like a big deal then for someone to tweet something for you. I probably sent it back to a couple people that I read and followed in that case, and they were like, this is cool. And I was like, oh, do you want to talk about, I don't know, I had some weird question for them, and we sort of started a dialogue. And then a couple months later, I certainly did not do that looking for a job. I didn't even think there was a job. Like, it didn't even occur to me that there was a job there. But it just started a relationship and connection. And then they emailed me a couple months later and were like, we actually want to hire someone, with editorial background, but not necessarily from like the food space, not necessarily from a food magazine, because we want to have a different perspective. What do you think? And I was like, this is totally what I want to do. And we met and got together and had dinner, and it was just like a great fit. So that was the origin story. And honestly, all other jobs that I've had actually came from similar things, where I emailed someone who had gone to Penn and asked. And I think the thing about those things is like, you often expect that it's frustrating when nothing comes of them right away. Like, you email someone and you're like, well, nothing happened. I emailed 10 people and nothing happened. And like, I think the reality is that sometimes it takes months or years where like, then that person remembers like 3 years later, like, oh, that person, remember? And then I followed them on Instagram or something, and like, oh, they're up to that now. And so those connections can take a really long time to pay off, but it's worth making them if they make sense. I mean, and I think when you send stuff like that, it's good for it to be purposeful. Like, you might enjoy this, rather than just saying like, do you have time to chat about something? Because I think that can feel like, I think if you're offering something like, I thought you might find this interesting, like that can be a better way in than just sort of saying like, do you have time for me to pick your brain? Because I think people get a lot of those asks. Another piece of advice that I often give there is like, try talking to people who are like a couple of years out of school, like who might actually be the ones who are looking for like the entry level positions. It's not always necessarily the person that's been there for 5 or 10 years that's doing that. So, and those people, I think, are going to be really flattered and excited to talk to you, that you're reaching out to them for advice. So if there are people who are in a class who are with you, or in a club with you at Penn, who are a couple years out, who are in their first jobs, I think this is a really good resource that people don't always think to make use of.
I think maybe we have time for one more.
So in a world that's like everything is now very politicized, including food, where there are issues of authenticity and appropriation, how do you think when you go in and review a restaurant that you can do kind of background research? For example, like last night, I think you guys reviewed like a Palestinian restaurant. So how do you go in and give a review that's not going to offend anyone, but also presents the cuisine and maybe the dishes in kind of an appropriate context of not only history and culture, but also not just going to a Palestinian restaurant and being like, oh, this tasted good, but knowing what the dish is, and et cetera, et cetera.
It's a great question, and definitely a big challenge when you're not a publication that's written by thousands of people, like a user-generated platform where, of course, no matter how many writers you have, not everyone's going to be from. You're not going to have someone who's from representative of every single culture. So I think it goes back to the same thing I was saying before about context and educating yourself. And also I think it's that thing that I was saying before, where you don't always necessarily see that someone's not necessarily like banging you over the head by saying like, I researched this. I all those questions that you asked are all the exact ones that we ask. So how do we do our research? How do we read up on this cuisine? You don't have to, without necessarily saying like, we read up on this cuisine or we visited all these comparable restaurants or whatever, but that is something that we do. And so we go and sort of see like, what's comparable? Is this writer specifically like the right person to approach that? Do they know that? Is there someone else in the office or that we know that we can talk to and say like, what do you think? Do you want to come with us to the restaurant? So we have people throughout the company who do have different experiences, and so oftentimes we might bring them along or find someone we can talk to and help us understand. So there's a lot of research and context, and it's always a conversation and something that as the writers spend more time, they get better at, and more knowledge, they acquire more knowledge. And again, it's like it's really about asking those exact questions that you asked. So you're on I think that's the exact right path, and those are the things that we encourage everyone to think about, and always like welcome feedback too. Like sometimes people do write in and say, you didn't get this quite right. Good try, but you're a little off, and that's okay too. So it's like the best thing is just having a dialogue, and it's great that the as you said, like it can be politicized, but it can also like be a really interesting dialogue that opens up a productive conversation. And but we put a lot of care into being respectful and thoughtful and accurate.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to Hillary.
Thank you.
Please check out the Infatuation, and you'll hang out for a few minutes,
definitely.
right? And say whatever to whoever. But thanks. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.